Before we begin the seminar, we'd like you all to scan the QR code, which will take you to a Padlet. Throughout the seminar, please type any questions that you have onto the Padlet and a teacher will respond to you in the coming week. Good morning or afternoon, Year 12. We're here to present on the Common Module Seminar. We hope you've had a restful break. I'm Miss Dagasso, and with me I have
Miss McCowan. Hi, Year 12. Hope you've rested well but ready to get stuck into some serious revision. It's not long now, as prolonged as it has been. The finish line is in sight. Lovely little analogy there.
It is. We've also got a special guest here today. You might be able to hear her. Miss Cowan, do you want to talk about who's with us?
That would be my bird Pikachu, who is thoroughly pumped about human experiences. So she's going to help guide us on this journey today.
Perfect. All right, so we're going to start with going through section 1 of paper 1. There are a few points that we thought we'd like to remind you of, and we have gone over this before. But again, in your preparation, we know you've got all the tools that you need to be able to answer the questions, but it's important to remember these points. So it's important to remember what it's going to be made up of. So we know it's going to be a reading task with a series of texts. You'll be required to respond to a number of unseen texts in a variety of forms. So poetry, non-fiction, website, editorial, article, fiction, extract.
Speeches, anything like that. You've got to remember that the key thing is that you need to analyse each of the texts. So really looking for those techniques, which you really should be looking for during your reading time. And we'll get back to using your reading time effectively in a moment. The key thing here, remember, the module is called Texts and Human Experiences. So it's the human experiences component that is really, really important. So whether or not the question tells you what the human experience is or you have to determine what those human experiences are, they are at the crux of what you need to be looking for.
And as Miss just said, it's important to really remember some key points. So one of those is remembering the rubric and specifically the language of the rubric. Any questions that you'll be asked within paper 1 are always going to be structured through the language of the rubric. So it's really important that you go over that. And the most important thing out of anything is going over the amount of time you have and always checking the clock throughout. So in your time over the next 5 weeks before that November 9, it's really important that you are practicing in timed conditions and really watching the clock and considering how long each question is taking you. So Miss McCowan has broken down what you would be expected, the amount of time I should say that you would be expected to allocate to each of those questions.
So really simply, and for those of you who have ever experienced my mathematical ability, it is limited. So I guarantee you I've had this triple checked. I am an English teacher after all. So roughly we look at for every mark, 2 minutes, 15 seconds. It's an approximation, obviously, and then you can make up time and things like that as well. So there's basic rundown, not going to go through it all, but basically how much time you should be spending on each of those short answer questions in ultimately, to get the best out of yourself and using your time wisely. What you do also need to take into consideration, so say if it's a 7-mark question and you can have 15 minutes, 45 seconds on it, that includes actually going back, rereading and editing your response as well. So it's not just writing time. So that's something to think about.
So the structure of our seminar today, essentially we'd like to look at some questions from section 1 of paper 1, and we're also going to be looking at some questions for paper 2 of paper 2, section 2 of paper 1. And what we essentially going to be looking at is the language used in these questions and what might be required of a response. Now, having the actual exam with the text isn't as important because what we're looking for is the language of the question. So, Miss McCowan, I might let you read out the first one and then we'll have a chat and have a think about how we might respond to that.
Perfect. And just before we go into that, we were chatting about this before we started this seminar, and it's kind of really good to have 2 different voices and how to break down questions because unlike maths and things like that, there is more than one answer. So we may come at this 2 different ways as 2 different people, but ultimately we can both be correct. So just something to think about there. So as Mr. Dagasso said, you don't have the texts there, but that doesn't matter because we're just looking at the language of the question. So the first one is a photograph. How does the photographer capture the complexities of the family's experience? So if we're breaking down this question, obviously your how is you need to show. So we're looking at examples, we're looking at techniques. Obviously it's a photograph, so there needs to be those visual elements there.
Yeah, so we're looking at things like the salience, the contrast, what's in the foreground, what's in the background, all of these skills that you guys have. But you know, as soon as you see that it is a photograph, you're going to be needing to use language like that, and that's where that how comes in. So we also have here a really important word when it comes to complexities. So obviously the question in its entirety is, how does the photographer capture the complexities of the family's experience? But you need to be thinking about what those complexities of the family's experience actually are. What are complexities? Because if you write a response that just regurgitates the question and says the composer captures the complexities of the family's experience through the salient feature of the man holding the child's hand. Yes, that's not wrong. We can see that they're holding hands, but by just repeating the word complexities, you're doing yourself a disservice.
So you really need to point out what the complexity of that moment is. Also, coming back to what we said before, the module is about experiences. So it says here of the family's experience. Well, what is that experience there? That's really important, that you are really specific in saying that the complexities surrounding the family's experience of war, you've identified that family experience, but what then are the complexities and those sorts of things as well.
So perhaps, and Ms. McCowan just gave a great example, let's say the image is of a family in a war-torn situation. Clearly the complexities of that family's experience within a war-torn situation can be very different to the complexities of another family situation that might find themselves in a differing context. So a particular complexity that a family might experience in a war-torn situation is struggle. So you should be specific in outlining that the complexities of struggle for that family within that experience is really important in mentioning. So as soon as you see a question like this, you need to really be considering, okay, well, how would I define that word? And not just complexities, but the family experience. It's suggesting that the family is a unit and there's a sense of togetherness. It's not asking about the individual's experience. We're asking about this collective group familiar experience.
A little hot tip with visuals as well. Often they're given a title. A photograph is given a title, or an artwork's given a title similar to a book or a poem, and it has a composer. Sometimes it has a composition date. So all of those things could be used as clues in order to kind of help you have a bit of a better understanding of the context of the text, even if you don't have, an exhaustive background knowledge about it. But those sort of things can actually help guide your response as well.
Definitely. And often you might not get a photograph, you might get an artwork or a poster. It could even be a poster that perhaps was a propaganda poster throughout the 1940s. So you need to be looking at those hints, like Ms. McCowan's just said. At the bottom it'll say when it was released, and you'll definitely be able to almost decipher or follow the clues to be able to analyse it in even more depth and really consider the context of it as well.
And if it happens to be this question here is obviously just about a photograph, but happen to be, a feature article of something, and there is an image and text in the thing, you can actually look at both the visual components and the written components if they are both there and very obvious, and help then to answer your question as well. So just picking up the nuances of the text types is important as well.
Yeah, really important. So the next question, I suppose, we'll move on to it. Yep.
Yeah.
So question 2, it's worth 4 marks. So if you have an opportunity, well, you should, because we've got 5 weeks, you can rewind this video and actually have a look at that breakdown again as you go through some of these questions, or as you go through a practice paper of your own, and really consider, okay, well, the first question's worth 3 marks and the second one's worth 4. So what is going to be the difference in my response for that next one to be worth that extra mark? And usually you'll be able to see through the language of the question that they are expecting that little bit more from your response, or that little bit more when it comes to the evidence that you're providing. So the question for the second question is in response to a poem, and it says, explain how the composer draws the reader's attention to the belief that the lives of human beings are a performance? So this is quite a difficult one.
It is. It is a tough question. It was, I will give a bit of a disclaimer, it is a Shakespeare sonnet, so we didn't want to put the word Shakespeare in to scare little folk.
We don't want to scare people.
But it is a complex question, but I think it's super important to have those complex questions in there. Because ultimately there are going to be common questions between the standard and the advanced paper, and then there's going to be standalone questions for the different levels as well.
Which is exactly why this seminar is for both standard and advanced.
Exactly.
Because you'll have that same paper on that day.
Exactly. So I guess going back to the mark values, if you have a look at question 1, it's how does. The question 2 is explain how. So the verb there changes. So we're really looking for that explain, that cause and effect, that sort of idea. Now, those of you who do studies of religion will be very, very familiar, hopefully, with the use of verbs and things like that as well. So the explain is what then is going to, we expect more in that instance because of that verb. So explain how the composer draws the reader's attention. So effective. You're going to be using a word, the composer uses things effectively because that's how they're going to draw that attention there. To the belief that the lives of human beings are a performance.
Shakespeare also had a quote about all the world's a stage.
It's that. That is the section. So this whole idea of it is that the lives of human beings are a performance. It's not one person, it is collective. So again, going back to that whole idea about using the terminology of the rubric is the collective human experience of us, engaging in performances. And basically what it suggests is that we play many different roles in our society.
Definitely. And that metaphor in itself, the lives of human beings are a performance. So it's not saying that human beings are constantly performing. It's saying that human beings, our lives, are a performance. So as Miss just said, perhaps we wear different hats in different situations. There's lots of ways we could look at this question, and there's going to be multiple ways to achieve full marks. There isn't just one set answer like there might be in maths. Obviously, English, we could have multiple answers for one question. So if we're thinking about human beings and our lives being a performance, think about your own context. Perhaps there are certain ways that you represent your lives to the world in one way that people perceive it, but it's very different in reality. And social media is a perfect example of that. A lot of you may, we all know we see this Instagram versus reality, and often what people are sharing of their lives in the real world is very different to what's happening behind closed doors.
Yeah, so even though it is a Shakespearean extract, say you get that, you won't get that in a reading task, but say you did, the question can often give away the meaning of the text, even if you may not directly understand it. So if you go through and you read your questions first, before you actually read the text, you may get an understanding, okay, this is all about how our lives as human beings are performances, right? How do I now know that? How have I been drawn into this idea based on, those techniques and those ways the composer has constructed that poem?
And Miss and I were just having a chat as well about the fact that often when we're analysing a text, we get so kind of enthralled or focused in the text that we often forget to reflect on how it then impacts on us.
Yes.
So particularly with this poem, obviously because you will have read the question before you read the poem, like Miss just said, you're going to be looking at ways that the poem represents the ways that human beings' lives are a performance, but you also need to consider in our own world what that then makes you think about your own world as a performance. And so it's really important that whether your teacher has taught you to write these analytical paragraphs as pedal, patil, steel, teal, whatever it is, they all eventuate in the same outcome. And that's really strong analysis using good examples that reflect on the impact within the text, and also the impact on us as readers or viewers or responders and what it makes us consider.
All right, everyone. Question 3, 6 marks. So again, we've jumped up that marking scale a little bit more. So again, we're going to need to, have more from you in response to the analysis and the depth of the analysis in your response. So we are moving into non-fiction, being an autobiography extract. The question is, How does the writer convey the influence of the collective experience on the individual?
This is quite different because if you think about the first two questions so far, it's been about the family experience. So we've got this collective, we've got the lives of people being a performance. Now we've really focused on the individual, that one person within society.
And I guess if you kind of put it in a contemporary context, it's looking how lockdown as our collective human experiences, but looking at one person's experience during that. So obviously this autobiography extract isn't about lockdown, but that's kind of to put it in the scheme of things that we're all going through this collective idea, but each person's experience is different. So we're really looking at that individual sort of idea. So we're looking at how, again, we're looking at that, going into details and giving really specific examples. How the composer,
quotes and techniques.
Exactly.
What techniques are being used to expose perhaps the differences of those individual experiences. Miss McCowan's example of lockdown's perfect. We know that, well, not that lockdown's perfect.
Not at all.
Lockdown is not fun at all.
Not at all.
But we know that as a collective, we're all going through that. But our experience of it differs based on a lot of things, based on our context, based on where we live, based on how much space we have, based on how fast our internet is.
Exactly.
There are a lot of different ways that we are experiencing something that's happening collectively differently. So you'll be looking for these quotes and techniques, language devices that are used by the author to truly expose the different kind of perspectives or experiences that people go through, despite it being a collective experience.
I think also what you need to think of, it is saying how the influence of the collective is then impact on the individual. So you actually need to pay respect to and note what the collective experience is, and then go into how the individual experience within that is maybe different, or in some aspects it could be similar. We don't know. The key word there, I think, though, is influence. So how does this collective experience influence the individual? So whether, if you come back to the rubric, you look at their motivations, their emotions, their experiences in general. You could look at things like how their lives have changed. Are they, inspired to see the world differently? So always coming back to those rubric ideas as well.
And you just used a really good word there in that, inspired to see the world differently. If you think about influence, we know that in our lives, being humans, human experiences, that we have good influences and bad influences. So you really need to think about, okay, well, what is this influence of the collective? We know that the influences could have positive ramifications, but they could also have negative ramifications. And I suppose because it is a 6-mark question, it makes sense that it's kind of a 3-pronged question in that we're looking for conveying influences of the collective on the individual.
100%.
So you really need to be addressing all parts of that question. Question 4 then goes up another step with 7 marks. So it's a fiction extract. And Miss, we were just having a chat about the way this question's worded, but particularly where we've got underlined text for.
Exactly. So it is a compare question, and this is very much a discriminating question as well. So in this instance, compare how composers shed light on human interactions. In your response, make reference to text 4. You have to, you do not have a choice, and one other text from text 1, 2, or 3. My advice, go with the one that you know and that you are really, really confident with doing. Because ultimately that, will help you, and it'll give you almost like a sense of achievement as well if you are really tackling something that you feel positive with.
I think it's worth noting as well, when it says and one other text, and even for text 4, you can reuse an example from one of the questions you've already responded to. Even if, you have responded to, let's say, the photograph, and you've picked out the salient feature and talked about the human experience there, if it is relevant to question 4, you can reuse that same example.
There'll be no reinventing wheels here. You might just need to make it shiny and put a new hubcap on it, to be quite honest. That's all you've got to do. Let's not make things more difficult than they need to be.
Definitely. Okay, so now moving to paper 1, section 2, what we would like to do is just break down each of these questions, talk about how you might create a thesis, and then it'd be a great idea using this for you to time yourself and respond to both of these questions using your own prescribed text. So question 1, storytelling distinguishes individual emotions from the collective mentality. To what extent do you agree with this statement based on your prescribed text? Break down the question. Consider all aspects. Storytelling distinguishes. What does that mean?
So for me, and again, we said before that we may have alternate perspectives and ideas on this, but for me, storytelling is about the composer, and it's about and how the composer constructs their poem, film, novel, whatever it is, text study that you did. It also links itself to me for a little bit of context because it's got a link to purpose. So why was Orwell wanting to tell 1984? Why did Daldry want to create Billy Elliot? What was the motivation or the purpose behind it? So for me, that storytelling is why or how the composer has constructed that text.
And I think you really need to think about, well, why do we as humans tell stories, particularly oral stories? Why do we tell our friends and family stories? We're trying to impart some type of experience upon them. And even if you think about Parrot and that context down in Tasmania, you know, what was Parrot trying to expose through that? So you need to think about the role of storytelling in society. When we see that word, it distinguishes individual emotions. Well, what is distinguishes? How do we distinguish things? It highlight, emphasize.
Show the difference.
Yeah.
Very much so. So we're looking at that individual and collective. So we're really looking at the separation of the two. Yes, there are going to be overlaps, and we'll get to that when we look at the to what extent part of that question. So emotions very much comes from the rubric. The key thing here is emotions that stem from experiences.
I also think this distinguish individual emotions from the collective mentality. This idea of a collective mentality links itself quite nicely to societal stereotypes, you know, the collective group and the way that it can influence people's actions. That links itself very nicely to not only 1984, but Daldry as well.
And Past the Shallows.
And Past the Shallows. This idea that often an individual's emotions can be quite different to a collective mentality.
And that's okay.
Or society's expectations, and that is okay. I know this is your favourite, a to what extent question, Miss?
Yeah, I love a good to what extent question because I think it actually opens up the scope for thought and not just regurgitation. And what I mean by that is you actually have to make a judgment if it's a to what extent question. And as I said before, if you are looking at a text and you think that the individual emotion is the same as the collective mentality, well, then you're going to argue to a limited extent. If your text is all about, so for example, 1984 is about Winston's individual emotions is so removed from the collective mentality, you're going to go to a significant extent. But there could be elements throughout your text as well where it does both. And you can actually say to a great extent, this can happen. However, to a more limited extent, and then you can show other examples as well. So it's actually showing, it's a way of engaging really deeply with that question.
And it's a great way too to kind of test your knowledge and get your perspective as well. I think, and we had a chat about this earlier, obviously this is important to have within your thesis and in that introduction, but that can't be the only place where you address that to what extent.
Not at all.
It needs to be fluid throughout your essay. And we often will think of, you know, our thesis as this base foundation. It's our core argument of how we're going to respond to the question. But then our topic sentences and in that analysis, we need to essentially proving our point. Wow, that sentence didn't make sense when I said it out loud. We got there. Yeah. So you need to make sure that it's not just something that you address in that introduction. We need to see that you've really considered the extent throughout your whole essay. And I suppose when we're thinking about our thesis, our topic sentences need to be really strong and linked to that. And we were just talking about that earlier.
100%. And this is where the choice of your analysis is really, really important. And when you are analyzing those quotes or those images or those scenes for whatever text you're doing. You really need to focus on not only the impact of the characters, the personas in the text, but also on the impact as us as the audience or the responders or the readers. I think that's really, really important to get you over the line and to really access those top bands in the marketing center.
Particularly if you think, so for example, if we think about that first question, this idea of individual emotions being distinguished from the collective mentality. Let's say we've got Billy in our mind and we know that Billy's individual emotions and the way he sees the world is certainly different from that collective mentality. So your thesis and your topic sentences will address that in a conceptual way, but in that analysis you need to talk about how, and I'm using Billy because obviously I've got Year 12 standard this year, but I'm sure Miss will be able to give an example for advanced. We need to think about, okay, well, we're exposed to Billy's emotions and we're shown that he is different and has a different perspective from that collective mentality within his context. So we obviously get a good insight into Billy's character and how it affects him. And I'll talk about that in my analysis, but then I'm going to go beyond the text and say, as a result, as viewers, we consider our own emotions in our world and our experiences and how those perspectives may differ from society now as well. And I suppose that's what every good text does. And because it is text and human experiences, you need to analyze within the text your prescribed 1984, Billy Elliot, or Past the Shallows, but then consider, okay, well, that's the impact on Billy, or that's the impact on Winston. What is the impact upon me having witnessed or viewed that human experience?
And that personal voice as well is really, really important, which I guess brings us into question 2. It is through seeing others, or should be seeing the lives of others or others' lives, the experiences, that new perspectives and reflections arise. How does this statement align with your understanding of your prescribed text? So it is about this whole idea of being presented with something new potentially in the lives and experiences of others. And I think that can come back to contextual sort of ideas as well, because obviously different composers have different takes on, you know, the world and they want to tell their story in some way. But it's also about not only you know, that new perspective or reflections arise. You could look at that within the text, but also, again, that personal voice and how our response to that text has influenced how we see the world and how we reflect on it.
And that inclusive language is so important because we know we don't write essays with, I believe that these experiences, it's just not the way that we write formal essays, because we need to be considering the impact of these texts on the collective, on us, the readers or the viewers. So when you are responding, and Miss McCowan just used this, our experiences, the way we reflect on it, and that inclusive language of we, us, we come to understand, we can, you know, comprehend that. You need to be using that inclusive language, particularly in response to a question like this, because it's actually saying, through seeing others' lives and experiences, we are offered new perspectives and reflections. So when you're responding to this, you need to think about, okay, well, how does this text that I've been reading all year show me something different about the lives of another? How is this text transporting me outside of Newcastle to another world that I haven't experienced, or another life that I have no connection to or understanding of?
Exactly. So it's just really looking at a text, but looking at it from your perspective, what you are taking from it. So if you have never lived under a totalitarian regime in 1984, you probably have had a really controlling teacher at school who has made your life difficult. Disclaimer, sorry, Year 12. But you can take those emotions and those experiences and maybe reflect on that and get a new perspective on maybe, you know, your Year 12 English teacher wasn't all that bad after all.
Yeah. I think it's important to remember too, you know, this question is saying seeing other lives and other experiences offers us new perspectives and kind of forces us to reflect on our own lives. So often when we read a text, We can feel quite a great deal of sympathy for characters in those situations, but we might not empathize with them because we've never been in those situations. And that's why, the wonderful world of reading, me, English teacher, nerding out over here, I love reading texts that transport me to different worlds and different places because they offer me different perspectives. And often I feel really grateful for the life I live or, where I live or how lucky I've been to, have the things that I have. And often when we're shown the stories of others who perhaps haven't been in a similar situation, it really broadens our perspective. So if you think about any of the texts, Billy Elliot, Past the Shallows, 1984, often when we reflect on the characters and their experiences, we certainly reflect on our own lives and how they differ.
100%. And you can often take more from a text when you can compare it or bring some, relationship between your world and the fictional world that is created in those texts as well. And that's what gives a text so much integrity, if you will, or influence in life. And that's why we have classical texts and things like that as well. If we have a look at the question, I think Mr. Gass and I were just talking that the key word in here is the word align. So in question 1, it was a to what extent. So you had to make a judgment. Now for me, Mr. Gasso, the word align is almost like forcing me to agree with that statement.
Yeah, I agree. And I think even though it is forcing you to agree with the statement, it's forcing you to agree by aligning it with your own understanding. And it all comes back to that rubric, text and human experiences. This idea, and it's just what we said, seeing other people's lives and other experiences offer us new perspectives and reflections. So it would have been hard to not agree with that anyway.
I think so. I think you're right. It's almost one of those things where you were always going to argue for anyway. So I think they're just taking away that maybe element of doubt that would exist.
And again, align. So you're aligning your ideas. You kind of, if anything, validating your core ideas and understanding and how it links to the text and this statement. But the fact that they're asking for your understanding is extremely important because this is a good time to remember that all of you are going to have different understandings and different perspectives of the text. So there isn't going to be one specific understanding that we're going to be looking for or the marker's going to be looking for. There's going to be multiple perspectives, multiple understandings. All of you have had differing experiences and that'll be reflected in your response, the way that you have received the text.
Exactly. And just like a bit of a side note, this might seem menial, a bit silly, but we see it every time we mark something. Can you please answer the question on the text you've studied in class? Your teacher hasn't mentioned the title 1,050 times for you to go, oh, I've seen that movie. I'll write on it because I liked it.
Yeah.
Please go with what you know well, not just what you like, what you know well.
So
it's just a hot
keyword where it says prescribed text in the exam, you're going to get a list of texts. Your one's going to be there. So
it's not a choose your own adventure, folks. It's not.
If you've studied 1984, please don't look through the list, see a movie you like and decide to write on that instead. You definitely need to go for the prescribed text that you studied in term 4 last year and that you have been working on for trials.
All right, Year 12, we might wrap it up there. Just a reminder that the Padlet will be up and functioning. So again, if you've got any questions now that you've watched the whole thing and you want to chuck them up there, by all means do so. We're encouraging you to do so. Keep in contact at a socially distanced space, but no, keep in contact with everyone because it is super important. We are really, really proud of each and every one of you. It's been super difficult and we're sorry that we can't be in front of you at the moment, but it won't be forever. We'll see you soon.
Yeah.
And if you've got any questions, obviously your class teachers are going to help you as much as they can as well.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
I guess my piece of advice, and I know Mr. Gasso has mentioned it the whole way through, is you need to practice writing under time conditions.
Handwriting.
With no notes in front of you.
Watching that clock.
ultimately you missed that experience in the trials, and that experience is so valuable.
Yeah, definitely. I think too, use your friends, use your support networks and your people around you. If, both of you, say got a partner, both of you respond to the same question, take some photos on your phone of the handwritten response, send it to each other as well. You should be reading each other's responses. Sometimes the most valuable study is reading the responses of your peers, and that's why we have exemplar essays to show you guys, what certain paragraphs can look like. So use each other, use your English teachers. Please look at the Padlet. Some people might be asking similar questions to ones that you have, and we'll be sure to respond to you over the coming week.
And I guess ultimately back yourselves. That you know that you can do this. We know you can. We know it's not ideal. Pikachu even chimed in then. She knows you can do it.
I thought we'd bored her to sleep.
No, she's woken up. She's back in the game. But in all seriousness, Year 12, back yourselves. Know you can do it because we know you can.
Yeah, 100%.
All right. We miss you.
And
we're
proud
done.
of you. See you later.
Bye.